Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming today. This presentation is specifically tailored to ecologists who are interested in Earth law, and I have good news. Earth law is for you. We're going to be exploring Earth law through water, which will take us through a variety of ecosystems around the world. And water connects the entire planet, right? From forests to the sea. Some themes that will run throughout the presentation are thinking about humans as nature, as a species living in an ecosystem, even a keystone species in certain cases. And then different approaches to knowledge production. And then we will look at some concrete examples of what Earth law is, not just philosophically, but in practice, and how it is currently changing relationships with rivers and the ocean. And so to do that, I'm going to start with just a very basic introduction to the foundation of the dominant legal system globally, which is Western law, and how it is very destructive. And then what the foundations are of Earth law and how it actually supports living systems. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but basically, the Western legal system, we're all here, I'm sure, pretty familiar with it. It is based on the separation of humans and nature. And while there is this thought in a lot of Western countries that capitalism is just the way it's always been, that's actually not the case. It's very new in human history. It's only 400 to 500 years old. And I really want to point out that private property is also an extremely new concept. It's very new. It was the first thing I learned in property law in law school, was that it was made up by English nobles who wanted to get more money from the farmers. So it was almost a joke at first of, let's just tell them we own the land and charge them rent, because how ridiculous is it to own land? So anyway, since capitalism and private property and all of that, laws began to support capitalism and that kind of economic system. And just to reframe capitalism a little bit, we tend to think that it is anthropocentric, right? Human-centered. But if you look at the definition, it is actually profit-centric. It is not about humans at all. It is about making money. According to the Oxford Dictionary, capitalism is an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit. Not for the benefit of humans, but for profit. So essentially, what happens is there becomes this one-way street. Humans are superior beings, and we are meant to meet our needs and desires via exploiting nature. And the word exploit is just littered in law everywhere. Now, Earth law is ecocentric. That doesn't mean it puts the environment first. That means it understands that human beings are part of the environment. We are part of the ecosystem, the habitat in which we live. And we live in relation to seasons and tides and other species. And it tries to rectify the one-way street by understanding everything is a web, essentially. And if we take a look at the Earth systems, it's also pretty easily recognizable that these are not things we can control. There are things that we need to learn to live with and work with for the benefit of all. Robin Wall Kimmerer has a beautiful saying that all flourishing is mutual. And I feel like what happens when we look at nature as a resource to be exploited emphasizes that point, because when the environment is not flourishing, we do not flourish. So you're all ecologists. I'm not going to belabor the ecological damage of any particular thing. I'm sure we all are aware that damming a river is bad uh, for many reasons beyond what I have listed here. But if you look at the very last bullet point, I'm including that humans are harmed by human made dams. And we see this all over the world consistently because we cannot thrive without an ecosystem. So, a really good example is the Hoover and Glen Canyon dams. They essentially stop the Colorado River from flowing into the Gulf of California. And this is actually an international disaster at this point because Mexico is suffering greatly from not having their traditional water source. And it is really harmful to the indigenous Kukapa people. Their fishing grounds have been completely destroyed because the fresh water is no longer creating the delta. And I'm going to throw in here a note on ecocide, which is sort of Earth law adjacent. It originates from tort law and the idea that people have to pay for the harms and their wrongdoings. But it is also rather ecocentric in that it recognizes we depend greatly on our environment. And if you destroy an ecosystem upon which people depend, it's its own form of genocide because you're taking away their tradition, their knowledge, their heritage, their food, their entire culture. And this has happened before. People have had to completely abandon areas, and the culture and the knowledge is gone along with the biodiversity that once lived there. And this form, this ecocide, was actually originally in all the drafts of the Rome Statute, but was taken out at the very last minute before the final version. And there is an international movement to add it to domestic law and the Rome Statute. But yeah, so to carry on with this, I'm not sure if you can see my pointer as I'm recording here, but we're at the very top of the large gulf here, the Gulf of California. You can see it appears quite dry. To me, it looks like sand, the color of sand. But back in 1949, Aldo Leopold called it, this lush, green, fertile river of life. And it was a wetland filled with migratory birds, fish nurseries, mesquite and cottonwood forests. I mean, it was a thriving place. And now it is suffering, and the entire Gulf is also suffering because when you stop a river flow, it's not getting nutrients, it's not getting sediment. It's really unacceptable. And if you can see my pointer, if you can't, you go all the way up to California. You can see the Bay Area right there. And then north of that, in that big, lush green spot, I grew up there. And I was jogging and found a plaque in my neighborhood talking about how salmon proteins had been found in redwood trees. And so this should disturb us on a very deep level when we think about how many rivers in the United States are dammed, which is basically all of them at multiple points. There's maybe one free-flowing river left, and there's a lot of dam removal projects, but redwood trees have proteins in them from a fish that lives almost its entire life at sea. That is how connected all of our ecosystems are. They are not discrete. And so, dams and other projects like that, obviously we didn't know what we were doing at the time, and we're figuring it out now. And the ocean is no different. If anything, we can literally see that all of the ocean is connected. There's a movement to drop the S from World Oceans Day to emphasize it is one ocean. Um, but the ocean is also a very unique space. It has suffered from open access, which is not the same as tragedy of the commons. Tragedy of the commons is a huge misnomer. Uh, but essentially, it is a place where no one is truly responsible for it. We dump our waste, we take all the fish, and we're just beginning to really understand how bad the damage is. Um, for those of you that remember the fishery collapse in the 90s, the early 90s of Canada, uh, you know, I keep hearing about how that's where all the fisheries in the entire world are going by 2050. And of course, as we know, um, the law, the dominant law, has tried to rectify these problems. Um, these are excerpts from UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And, at first you might think, oh, this is exciting language. We have to maintain and restore harvested species and, produce the maximum sustainable yield. But then you have a lot of conflicting language with that, right? If you don't harvest this maximum sustainable yield, you are required to let other states come into your exclusive economic zone, your EEZ, and do it. But you also have an obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment. But you have a sovereign right to exploit your natural resources. And it's essentially trying to use the same shovel that we got into this deep hole to dig ourselves out of the hole. There's no real understanding in Western law of what sustainable means and how to get there. Because as long as you're viewing things as a one-way street, as exploitation, it's not going to happen because we live in relation. That's how the world works. And the word exploit, every time I see it in law, I just cringe because what a resource is over the course of history has included human slaves, women and children, and in many parts of the world, it still does. And so we need to really think about how language shapes our perception and why we think it's not acceptable to exploit people, even though it happens, but totally acceptable to exploit life support systems that we depend on. So hopefully we're not all super depressed. Let's look at Earth law and how it is transforming the law itself and our relationship with the natural world. Earth law, as I think I mentioned earlier, is a very large umbrella term that includes a huge variety of approaches, including things you've probably heard of, like rights of nature. There's constitutional rights, there's guardianship agreements. And rights of nature, of course, includes like rights for rivers and rights for animals and the concept of legal personhood. And I'll get all into that further. But so the foundation of Earth law, what makes it very different from Western law is that it's based on indigenous cosmologies, philosophies, lifeways, and legalities. And a lot of common threads I've noticed from studying different cultures across the world is that they look at nature and instead of seeing scarcity, like how we're taught with Western economics, they see abundance. They see renewal every spring, bountiful, bountiful harvests every fall, and a lot of the world used to function on a gift economy. And gratitude, and they understand that we live in a relationship as part of nature. And my absolute favorite is the idea of reciprocity based in gratitude, right? You see the earth doing something for you, providing you with a food source or materials for clothing or your home. And so you act in gratitude forward. It's how a lot of gift economies functioned so well for so long. So a really good example of that when we're looking at rivers, I actually heard about the Klamath River Dam removal project my entire life. The Yorick tribe and others had a couple decade long legal battle to have these dams removed, and it is now the largest dam removal project in the United States. But to the Yorick, they're not just restoring a river and restoring the earth. They belong to it, and so they're restoring themselves and their people. And their approach was to write an ordinance into tribal law about their sovereignty to protect the health and well-being of the Halkik-Wiroy, which is also known as the Klamath River, and its associated ecosystems and native species dependent on the river. And it's very important that they made that expansion. So for those of you that are super interested, I included some excerpts from the ordinance here. And it is worth taking note that their approach does use the language of Western law. They're talking about rights, they're talking about property, they're talking about, their sovereignty as a people. And while it is not US law is required to recognize tribal law. And so they went the route of establishing their rights, which will hopefully give them standing in US courts if they need to defend the river and their rights. Now, it's a great approach. It has proven effective. The rights of nature movement, like this one, has had many successes. But not all Indigenous people want to do that. So there's a really fantastic paper called We Are the River by David Takash. And it's an amazing survey of earth law around the world, and it discusses the Te Arara Act in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And he points out that the law is first and foremost a reflection of human beliefs. And so when the Maori were having negotiations with the New Zealand government, they call themselves the Crown, they were offered ownership of the Te Arara ecosystem, that area, and the Wangunau River that flows from it. But they refused because that would put essentially their entire world upside down. Because you cannot own something to which you fundamentally belong. And so instead, they came up with essentially this treaty between the Maori and the Crown, and they wanted it to reflect their worldview. So hierarchy was replaced with relationship, dominance with interdependence, and property rights were replaced with interconnected management responsibilities. And so what happens now is there are Maori that represent the ecosystem and the river. But my absolute favorite piece that I think should just exist everywhere on the planet is that when a business wants to operate in the Te Arara ecosystem, it has to negotiate a friendship agreement demonstrating loyal affection to the Te Arara values and her need to continue complex balancing among all living things. And that is just, if all businesses had to do that, every place they operated, what an amazing change there would be to the world. So some more examples. This one is about legal personhood. And I apologize, I have only read these names. so I'm probably pronouncing things wrong. I've never heard them spoken before. So, the Hewa Kupanga Moana is a treaty between indigenous groups in Aotearoa, the Cook Islands, Tahiti, Tonga, and other Polynesian countries, stating that whales are legal persons. And for those of you that don't know, the concept of legal personhood is a way to understand how to interact with an entity. It has always been expanding. Originally, legal persons in Western law were only white land owning men. They were the only people that law would work with. And then it expanded to, women and people of color and children. And eventually we got the idea of a natural person, which is a human. They're a person under law. And then a legal person would be like a corporation. And we need corporations to be legal persons so that we can hold them responsible in the legal system. When we give legal personhood to animals and to rivers, it is more about duties of care and responsibilities and the ability for someone to represent them and speak for them than it is to hold them responsible. Like, no one's going to sue a river for flooding. If anything, the river is supposed to flood. So anyway, when it comes to whales, this is a recognition that the whales are not resources to be exploited, and that these indigenous groups view whales as their ancestors. And this is going to probably change customary international law because they're working with legal frameworks to protect whales in a very particular way as legal persons. And customary international law is not written, but it's something that all countries believe is law, and so they behave accordingly. There's all kinds of arguments about when it goes into effect and when it doesn't, but not the point of today. A very recent development, just last year at the UN Ocean Conference, French Polynesia announced that they are turning their entire EEZ into a marine protected area. This is extremely exciting, and what I really love about it is that it's backed by 90% of French Polynesian citizens. They spent 10 years working with local communities and scientists and international partners, and really embedding this in the cultural heritage. And it shows the importance of place-based decision making, because 90% of citizens, they're happy with how this is working because they had a say in it and they were part of the decision making process, and it is going to benefit them. So it's not just about hearing what people are saying, but actually respecting it and incorporating it into what is going on. And I want to say very specifically as well, while there are a lot of paper parks out there, places that are protected on paper but actually still destroyed, there's no deep sea mining or bottom trawling allowed. It is largely a mix of no-take areas, which is as protected as you can get. No human activities allowed there, and designated artisanal fishing zones. So this is very much about the ecosystem and the ecosystem providing for the people who live there. I'm going to spend a little time on Vanuatu because they have done so many amazing things. Their constitution in 1980 included the land belongs to the people and the people belong to the land, as well as an article stating that their customary law, as in the original law before colonization, continues to have effect as part of the Republic of Vanuatu. And that just embeds the relational worldviews and the legal personality of the earth into their formal system. which is another great legal approach. And internationally, they've had a huge impact. They spearheaded the global campaign to get an advisory opinion from the ICJ about states' obligations regarding the climate system for present and future generations. And they consistently use the term great ocean state instead of small island developing state, because they want to shift the narrative from, the Western idea of development and who is, behind and who is engaged in progress, to a view of ocean kinship and stewardship. And on that note, I also want to point out that the Great Island states have been leading the way for a very long time. Palau has a shark haven, and 80% of its exclusive economic zone is a no-take MPA. The other 20% is also for artisanal fishers, much like French Polynesia's new MPA. Fiji also, shortly after, created a shark sanctuary. And they were drawing on Vanua, which is an understanding of the kinship between land and sea. And of course, Aotearoa. They're just carrying on, and most of the island nations in the South Pacific, they have what's called a dual tenure system, which means the customary law or the traditional law of the people functions separately but equally alongside the statutory law. And that brings me to how we can share knowledge, and especially for ecologists. This is really big because people working in conservation have regularly asked for local indigenous input. And a lot of times what happens is the indigenous knowledge is assimilated or exploited in some way to try to make it more sciencey. But around the world, there is a practice which can be summarized as two-eyed seeing, which is the idea of holding the indigenous wisdom in one eye and the mainstream wisdom and ways of knowing in the other eye, and using both to benefit all. One of my favorite metaphors of this comes from the Yolngu people, and they are in present-day Australia. There is a place very special to them called Ganma, and it's where a river flows into the sea. So salt water and fresh water are meeting, and you can see a clear distinction where they don't mix, and instead they work together alongside each other. And yeah, it's just a very beautiful way to think about how we can move forward together, either as lawyers or as ecologists. And thank you so much for your time. And we will now do a Q&A. And if you want to contact me, there's my email. These slides will be made available shortly after this meeting. Okay, thanks so much.